Crystal Ball College Football. I'm your host, Grayson Grunhafer. And of course, today we're starting with the Red River Showdown. Texas versus Oklahoma. Crazy result, right? I mean, absolutely crazy result. Texas wins 49-0. And you go through kind of just this well-documented rivalry, right? And you look at the different matchups that we've seen from these two teams, and you see a bunch of close games, right? I mean, these two teams have been fairly evenly matched. Even when Texas or even when Oklahoma is clearly the better team, it always seems to end pretty close. Now, you go through history and you'll see some blowouts. You'll see OU won 63-14 one time. You'll see, Texas in 05 winning 45-12. And I really want to point that one out because if you go through and look at the last, 20 years really, that 45-12 win in 05 when Texas won the national championship is pretty much the biggest blowout that Texas has had, and by a mile, until Saturday. And I think that's kind of important to point out. We've seen Oklahoma have some of these games where they've really taken it to Texas, some anomalies here and there where they've blown them out, and OU over the past 20 years has been better than Texas, so it makes sense. But to see Texas really only have two of these games is rather interesting. And to go all the way back to a year when they won a national championship as the last time they really, really routed Oklahoma, like they have some wins by double digits, but to rout them like they did, haven't seen it since the national title. So I think that's important to point out. Texas took advantage of an Oklahoma team that was injured. Not having Dylan Gabriel was massive, like absolutely massive. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. I do want to point out one thing with Oklahoma in this game. So that first half was not as lopsided as the score would indicate at all. If you go through the game flow and you kind of look at how this game played out, the major mistakes that Oklahoma made in the first half really cost them. They're down 7-0. They got down to the Texas 9. They decided to go for it on 4th and 2. To Texas's credit, they held up, got a stop. You kick a field goal there, 7-3. Then it was 21-0. They had 1st and 10, and they decided to have their running back throw a pass in which he got intercepted. Texas turns right around, scores a touchdown to make it 28-0. I mean, let's just say they get 2 field goals. The score at halftime is 21-6. Like, if you really look at the first half, while Texas was dominating, OU was having some success. And it really was running the football. It was being patient in their offense. It wasn't forcing Davis Bevell to really do anything. I've heard many people say this, and I think it's 100% true. Every time Davis Bevell took a snap in this game, it was a loss of a down. It was horrible. I mean, it was absolutely terrible, and we'll get to him a little bit more later on. I do want to mention the second half, though, not close. Oklahoma, 6 of their 7 possessions in the second half were 3-and-outs. The only one that wasn't was their first possession of the second half, and it was only 5 plays. I mean, it was terrible, guys, and Texas was phenomenal defensively in the second half. They really tightened things up and didn't allow OU to run the football or really do anything. Oklahoma was also trying to play some catch-up there as they were down by a lot, had to force some things, and that just wasn't going to work out on this day. And for the Texas side of things, played a dominant performance. Got a huge win, blew out Oklahoma. I mean, shoot, you can't hope for much more than that. So on the Texas side of things, I do want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into them. I'll also dive into Oklahoma a little bit here in a minute. But it's fascinating what's going on with Texas right now. So their 2 losses to Alabama and Texas Tech. They didn't have Quinn Ewers for basically 1.5 games during those 2. And so they have 2 losses. And so you're sitting there and going, okay, so what is their ceiling? What can they do with this year? Can they salvage things and, maybe be a dark horse to make the college football playoff? I've heard people talk about that. And my thing when I'm kind of looking at their body of work right now, they just don't have a ton of big wins on their resume. And so those may come later. They still have a tough schedule. They got Iowa State next week, so that's not really going to move the needle at all. But at Oklahoma State, at Kansas, and then they also have TCU, at Kansas, and Baylor to close out the year. So it's going to get really tough for them. Very, very tough consecutive weeks in a row. So now it's just a matter of kind of making sure that some of these teams in the Big 12 have really good records and are ranked pretty highly, because Texas really needs to face as many, 10-win teams as they possibly can if they actually want to be in serious contention for the college football playoff. And the reason why I bring that up, I do think the College Football Playoff Committee will take into effect that, Quinn Ewers has missed those 2 games, right? He's missed a part of the Alabama game in which they lost and they were looking good with him. And then he missed the Tech game that they lost. Again, they're going to need complete and utter chaos for this to happen. But I think an 11-2 Texas team with the Big 12 championship and their 2 losses being without Quinn, that's a big deal. That is a big deal. And I'd be on their side with that. If Texas runs through the rest of their schedule and they're sitting there at 11-2 and you're seeing teams without conference championships sitting there, I think it's a discussion that you should have. Now, they also need Alabama to probably be in the college football playoff for that to happen. They probably need Tech to at least be a bowl team to make it look a little bit better. But in general, the idea of that's rather interesting. And I think it all comes down to the fact that their offensive line's playing well, their run game is playing well, and Quinn is a difference maker at quarterback. He absolutely is. And I think that whole kind of come together of this offense under Steve Sarkisian has been really fun to watch. You saw their explosiveness against Oklahoma. Now they just need to keep that going into these future matchups. And so, I want to bring up a couple other things. So Kelvin Banks, their freshman tackle, holy cow. The guy's an NFL guy. I mean, I knew he was good coming out of high school, clearly a 5-star guy, but for him to step in the way he has, utterly impressive. I think a lot of people thought their offensive line was going to be a massive problem. It has not been up to this point in the season. Another little nugget to bring up, and I know Joel Klatt kind of mentioned this, so I found it just really fascinating. So Quinn Ewers in 20 drives against UL Monroe, Alabama, Oklahoma. He's averaging more points per drive than CJ Stroud is at Ohio State. That's pretty crazy. I think CJ Stroud, he's probably the consensus Heisman winner at this moment in the season. There's probably only one other guy that you could probably mention, and that's Hendon Hooker. And Quinn is right on pace with him. He's actually technically been better than him at moving his team down the field and getting points. Fascinating stuff going on at Texas. I'm so curious to see how that translates going forward. Moving on to the Oklahoma side, though, a couple things here. I think with Brent Venables, he's still learning how to be a head coach. I think that's apparent. I think I overestimated the talent they brought in and underestimated what they lost. So if that makes sense, they lost a lot. They didn't replace it with quite enough for them to be as good as I kind of thought they would be going into this year. It reminds me a lot of kind of what happened with Dave Aranda in his first year at Baylor. Now, Brent's not dealing with COVID, the COVID struggles that Dave had to deal with, but it is that first year as a head coach, being a defensive-minded coach and trying to kind of navigate through figuring out who you are as a head coach. And so right now, the defense is a mess. We know this season is not going to go very well. I think if you kind of look at the grand scheme of things, they're probably going to lose, 3, maybe 4 more times, kind of depending on the status of Dylan Gabriel. And I also think it's important to mention that they didn't have a contingency plan for Dylan Gabriel, and that's a problem. But I also want to kind of mention this because I don't feel like it's being talked enough about. In the transfer portal era, it is so difficult to get 2 transfers at the same position, especially at quarterback, where only one is going to play. So they went with Dylan Gabriel. They got really unlucky with the hit that he took against TCU. I mean, it's just it was a cheap shot. And it's nothing you can control. It happens. It's the game of football. And so he gets hurt in that game. And now they're sitting here with literally nothing on offense outside just trying to run the football as much as they can. And so it's just tough. And I can't blame them for that because, again, transfer portal, very difficult to get 2 quarterbacks to want to transfer to your school if they have, 1 year of eligibility remaining. So that's kind of tough. I will say on the flip side, though, they had an opportunity to beat Kansas State. They were squarely in that game. They put up a lot of points. They looked really good offensively. They just came up short. Against TCU, their quarterback got hurt, and it was 34-17 when he got hurt. In my eyes, I think that Oklahoma probably scores high 30s, low 40s in that game. They lose that game, but I think we'd be talking about it a lot differently than we currently are at this moment. And then who knows against Texas? You never know. When you have your starting quarterback, if he's able to make enough throws, I still think they lose. But again, I think the game looks much closer and much different. And now they get Kansas this week at home. And guys, you're going to be shocked by this. they're a 7.5 point favorite against Kansas. I'll probably talk about that matchup later in the week, but it's very interesting. It just shows how much Vegas does respect Oklahoma when they have a healthy Dillon Gabriel. We'll see if they actually get that, and we'll see if they're able to salvage their season if their offense gets an uptick. Because right now it doesn't look like their defense is going to get much of an uptick, maybe until the very end of the year when Brent can really get things ingrained in his team. So overall, not a fun game for Oklahoma, great game for Texas, and now two teams trending in completely opposite directions as the season continues. Thanks for joining this week. I'm going to talk about all kinds of stuff this week. Got a lot of episodes coming up for later in the week, but I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening to Crystal Ball College Football.